The aircraft touched down just after sunrise, the wheels screeching softly against the familiar soil of the country I had not stepped on in 10 long years. As I looked through the window, watching workers guide the plane into place, my chest tightened with a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and anticipation I could barely contain. Every year I had stayed away had been for one reason, and one reason only: my daughter. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. But first, if you enjoy stories like this, you want to be part of the 10% viewers who click on the like button. It makes us really happy. If you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly support us today by subscribing to this channel. This helps us to bring you more beautiful stories. It will be great to tell us where you are watching us from in the comments section. Every overtime shift, every missed holiday, every lonely night in a rented room overseas had been endured with the single promise that one day I would return to her stronger, wealthier, and ready to give her the life she deserved. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways, always ending the same, with my daughter running into my arms in front of the house I bought for her with the sweat of my youth. The drive from the airport felt unreal. Streets I once knew by heart now had new buildings, new signs, new rhythms. I watched everything through the window of the taxi like a stranger returning to a life that had continued without waiting for me. My suitcase felt heavier than its contents, not from clothes or gifts, but from the years of distance it carried within its stitching. The driver chatted casually, unaware that my silence was not rudeness but memory pressing against my ribs. With every kilometer closer to the house, my pulse beat faster. I pictured my daughter standing by the gate, smiling the way she used to when she was still small, before time stretched us into strangers. I remembered the day I left as if it were happening again inside my head. She had been only a teenager then, clinging to my arm at the airport, her tears soaking through my shirt while I promised her that everything I was doing was for her future. I told her about the house I had already paid for in installments, how one day it would be entirely hers, how she would never need to beg anyone for shelter or dignity. I told her she would have a place of her own where no one could ever treat her like less than she was. She had nodded bravely through her tears, trusting me with a faith that now felt dangerously fragile. When the taxi finally turned into the familiar street, my breath caught in my throat. The house was still there. Painted, renovated, larger than I remembered. New fence, new gate, new satellite dish on the roof. Pride swelled in my chest for just a moment. That house was proof of everything I had sacrificed, proof that no matter how far I had gone, I had not worked in vain. I paid the driver, stepped out with my suitcase, and stood for a brief second across the street, simply absorbing the sight of the home I had built with my absence. I crossed the road slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I pressed the bell beside the gate. My mind raced with imagined scenarios, my daughter laughing inside, perhaps unaware of the surprise waiting for her, relatives gathering around in shock and joy, neighbors whispering, "Her father is back." The bell rang inside the compound. I waited, heart thudding with a strange nervous excitement that felt like both youth and age colliding in my chest. Footsteps approached from within. I adjusted my jacket and prepared myself for the face I had not seen in a decade. The gate opened. A young woman stood there, dressed in a maid's uniform. At first, my mind refused to connect the image to any meaning. I saw a bowed head. I saw hands clasped nervously at the waist. I saw tired eyes that lifted only slightly before dropping again. For a fleeting moment, I thought my daughter had hired domestic help, that this was simply an employee. Then the woman lifted her face just enough for the morning light to fall across her features, and my heart stopped in my chest. It was my daughter. Her face had matured, sharpened by years of quiet endurance, but I would have recognized her anywhere. The same eyes, the same curve of her nose, the same tiny scar near her left eyebrow from when she fell as a child, and I carried her bleeding into the clinic. But now those familiar features were framed by a maid's uniform. An apron, flat shoes. Humility stitched into fabric. She froze when she saw me, her breath catching in her throat as if she were staring at a ghost instead of her own father. For a full second, neither of us moved. Then her hands began to shake. "Sir," she whispered automatically, the words slipping out before she could stop it, trained into her by repetition and fear. That single word crushed something deep inside me. I dropped my suitcase where I stood. The sound of it hitting the ground felt distant, as though I were hearing it from underwater. My daughter, my child, for whom I had bled and labored and disappeared from the world, had just addressed me as sir in my own house. The shock was so violent it robbed me of speech. I opened my mouth to speak her name, but no sound came out. My eyes searched her face desperately for any sign that this was some horrible misunderstanding. Her lips trembled. Her eyes filled with tears she fought desperately to contain. "Papa," she finally whispered, uncertain, as if afraid the word might break the illusion of safety she had been forced to build around herself. That was when the truth slammed into me with full force. Something was horribly, irreversibly wrong. Before I could take a step toward her, voices drifted from inside the house. Laughter, the clink of dishes, casual conversation belonging to people who sounded far too comfortable inside a home that was supposed to belong to my daughter alone. A woman's voice called out sharply from inside, impatient and commanding. "Why are you standing there? Did you open the gate or not?" My daughter flinched. That flinch did something to me I cannot put into gentle words. It was not fear in the dramatic sense. It was conditioned fear. The kind that lives quietly inside the body long after shouting has stopped. The kind that teaches you to shrink before a voice finishes its sentence. I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides as I stepped forward without thinking, positioning myself slightly between my daughter and the house behind her. I'll be right there," she called back quickly, her voice soft but urgent. Her eyes met mine again, and in them I saw not surprise, not joy, not even immediate relief, but terror. Terror of being seen talking to me. Terror of delay. Terror of consequence. My stomach twisted as understanding began to creep through my shock in slow, poisonous waves. "Who speaks to you like that?" I asked quietly. She shook her head faintly, a silent plea for me not to ask that question here. Her hands trembled harder now, and that was when a man appeared behind her, stepping into view with effortless authority. He was well-dressed, wearing the relaxed arrogance of someone who owned both space and people. He glanced at me briefly, then at my daughter. "Who is this?" he demanded. For a moment, my daughter could not speak. I lifted my head slowly and looked him directly in the eyes. "I am her father," I said. The man laughed. The sound of his laughter echoed inside my skull like an insult too heavy for sound alone. "Her father," he repeated, amused. "That's impossible. This girl is staff here." "Staff?" "In the house I bought for my child." An icy calm settled over me as the puzzle pieces began sliding into place with horrifying clarity. I turned slowly to look at my daughter again, and she could no longer hold back her tears. They rolled down her cheeks silently as she nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "They said you abandoned the house," she whispered. "They said you would never come back." My vision blurred. I felt 10 years of sacrifice collapse inward like a corpse that had only just been told it was dead. I looked past her into the house, seeing movement now, other figures standing, watching, whispering. Strangers occupying rooms I once imagined my daughter filling with her laughter and independence. Strangers sitting where I had once imagined teaching her how to manage the home, how to live with dignity, how to be safe. And in that moment, as the truth finally formed fully in my chest, one thing became violently clear. I had not returned to surprise my daughter. I had returned to retrieve her from captivity. The man who had laughed at me stood with his arms folded now, studying me as if I were an inconvenience that had wandered into his afternoon rather than the legal owner of the house beneath his polished shoes. My daughter remained frozen between us, her body angled in that subtle way people adopt when they have learned that space itself can be dangerous. I saw how she kept her shoulders slightly hunched, how her eyes tracked the man before returning to me, how her hands trembled even when she tried to press them still against the fabric of her uniform. 10 years abroad had taught me many things about human behavior, but nothing prepared me for the sight of my own child wearing fear like an everyday garment. "Staff doesn't open the gate for strangers," the man said dismissively. "Do your job and go back inside." My daughter flinched again and took a half-step backward before she could stop herself. I felt something ancient and protective surge inside me with a force I had not known in years. I placed one hand gently on her shoulder, not pulling her toward me yet, only grounding her where she stood so she could feel that she was not alone. Her body stiffened at the contact, as if she were afraid I would disappear if she leaned into the truth of my presence too quickly. "She is not your staff," I said calmly, though my voice carried an edge that even I barely recognized. "And you are standing in a house that does not belong to you." The man's expression shifted, irritation sharpening his features. "Listen," he said, leaning slightly forward, "I don't know what story you're trying to sell, but this house belongs to my wife's family. This girl works here. If you don't leave this gate right now, we will handle this as trespassing." My daughter sucked in a breath so quick and quiet it nearly vanished. I felt the tension ripple through her shoulder beneath my palm. "Papa, please," she whispered urgently, barely moving her lips. "It's not safe for you to argue here." That sentence broke something in me far more deeply than the uniform ever could. A child's instinct toward silence in the face of injustice is not born, it is taught. Carefully, repeatedly, through consequence. I realized with sickening clarity that whatever had happened inside this house over the last 10 years had conditioned my daughter to believe that resistance was dangerous and obedience was survival. "I'm not leaving," I said quietly. The man let out an exasperated breath and turned back toward the house. "Call security," he barked to someone inside. Before he could fully turn away, I reached into my jacket and withdrew a folded document I had carried in the inner pocket for the entire journey home. The deed. My name still printed clearly at the top. I unfolded it slowly, deliberately, and held it up where both he and my daughter could see it. "This house was purchased in my name 10 years ago," I said steadily. "Every installment, every fee, every tax, and it was designated for my daughter's use. You and everyone inside that house are occupying it under false authority." The air changed immediately. The man's confidence faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before defense rushed back in to replace it. "Anyone can waive paper," he said. "This means nothing without verification." My daughter stared at the document as if it were a sacred object. Her hands lifted slightly, as if she wanted to touch it to confirm that it was real. Her eyes filled with a cautious, almost painful hope that flickered and threatened to go out just as quickly. I realized then how completely she had been cut off from even the idea of ownership. The concept itself had become foreign to her reality. "Papa," she whispered again, her voice shaking now. "It's true what they said. They told me you sold the house. They said you left it to Auntie and Uncle before you disappeared. They said I should be grateful they allowed me to stay as help." Each word landed like a physical blow. "They said the money you sent was no longer enough to maintain the property. They told me I owed them for shelter, for food, for my place here." I felt heat rise behind my eyes, not in tears, but in a rage so controlled it frightened me. My own family had rewritten my absence into abandonment, my provision into obligation, my daughter's rightful place into indebted servitude. The man scoffed. "You filled her head with nonsense before you ran off," he said dismissively. "I didn't run," I replied softly. "I worked." A woman emerged from the house then, older, sharp-eyed, wearing expensive jewelry that caught the sunlight arrogantly as she folded her arms. I recognized her instantly. My sister-in-law, the very person I had trusted with my accounts while I worked abroad. "What is this noise?" she demanded. Her eyes fell on me, and the color drained from her face with shocking speed. Her composure returned almost immediately, but the damage was already done. Recognition had been instant. Shock had been unguarded. "You," she said faintly. "You're supposed to be abroad." "I came home," I replied. "To my house. To my daughter." Her lips tightened. "You should have informed us. You should not have stolen my child's life," I answered calmly. The man beside her stiffened. "Stolen? What are you saying?" She did not answer him immediately. The delay told me everything. "We took responsibility for a property that had been abandoned for a decade," she said finally. "We took responsibility for a girl who was left alone. You sent money, yes, but you did not send supervision. You did not send protection. We did what was necessary." Necessary. The same word families always use when they want to make theft sound like care. "You did not take responsibility," I said. "You took control." Her eyes flicked briefly to my daughter. I followed the glance, and in that motion, I saw the full geometry of power inside this house. My child was not cared for here. She was leveraged. She wouldn't have survived alone, my sister-in-law said coldly. She needed structure. She needed discipline. The world is not gentle with girls without oversight. And you provided that oversight by dressing her as a servant in her own home? I asked quietly. By erasing her ownership and installing yourselves as her masters? My daughter's breath shuddered beside me. I felt the word masters echo through her body in a way no child's body ever should. She eats, the woman said bluntly. She has a roof. She is not abused. My daughter's silence spoke louder than any testimony. She wakes before dawn, she whispered suddenly, her voice so low it barely carried. I clean. I cook. I wash. I serve. They said school is a luxury we can't afford anymore. They said I must earn my keep. The woman's eyes flashed. Enough, she snapped. My daughter shrank back as if struck. That was all I needed to see. In that moment, the remaining doubt died. I turned fully toward my sister-in-law. You will release her immediately, I said with absolute calm. She will leave this house with me today. Anything she has been prevented from owning will be restored. And then I will begin unraveling everything you built on my absence. The man laughed again, though this time the sound was brittle. You think you can just walk in and take over after 10 years? Yes, I answered simply. Because the law did not leave while I was gone. My sister-in-law's face hardened. Then you will learn how complicated things have become in your absence. I already see how simple it actually is, I replied. You assumed silence was surrender. You assumed distance was denial. You assumed my child would never be defended. I placed my hand fully around my daughter's now and drew her gently but firmly to my side. Her body trembled in shock at the freedom implied in that movement. She stared at me as if afraid that stepping too far from the gate would trigger a punishment she had learned to expect. Go inside and get your things, I said softly. Only what belongs to you. She didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she nodded. As she turned toward the house, the woman lunged forward. She doesn't go anywhere without. She goes wherever I say she goes, I interrupted calmly. And I promise you, if a single finger is placed on her in an attempt to stop her, this will become much more than a family matter. The house had grown completely silent. Even the man no longer laughed. My daughter disappeared into the house with the cautious speed of someone leaving a place that had never allowed her to leave before. I stood at the gate, watching the building that had once symbolized safety now stand exposed as what it truly was, a gilded prison constructed from lies, greed, and my misplaced trust. 10 years ago, I had left to build her a future. Today, I was here to take it back. My daughter returned from inside the house carrying only a small bag, the kind you pack when you have learned not to own much because possession makes you a target. The sight of it nearly brought me to my knees. 10 years of my earnings had bought that house, had funded everything inside it, and yet my child stood before me with nothing more than a single bag slung over her shoulder like a fugitive escaping in daylight. Her eyes never left the front door as she approached me, as though she expected someone to yell, to strike, to pull her back into silence at any second. When she reached my side, she clutched my sleeve with a tension that told me freedom was still a fragile concept to her. We did not speak immediately. I guided her slowly away from the gate, putting physical distance between her and the house before allowing breath to return fully to my chest. With every step, her posture shifted slightly, minute changes in the angle of her shoulders and the rhythm of her stride revealing a body that had learned to move under supervision for far too long. Only when we reached the end of the street did she finally exhale, as if she had been holding air inside her lungs for years without noticing. We sat on a low wall beneath a tree whose shade fell unevenly across our faces. For a long time, we simply looked at the ground in silence. I wanted to ask everything at once. When did it start? Who moved in first? How did they convince her that the house no longer belonged to her? But my instincts told me that trauma does not arrive all at once when asked. It surfaces in fragments, only where it feels safe to breathe. They waited 2 years after you left, she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. For a long time, things were normal. They visited often. They said it was because you asked them to look after me. I believed them. I was still in school then. I felt protected because they were family. My chest tightened as she spoke. 2 years. That meant she had lived alone in dignity for a time, trusting that the house was truly hers. Then the visits increased, she continued. They started staying longer. At first it was a night, then weekends, then weeks. They said they were managing the property for you. They said you wanted them to oversee renovations. Her hands twisted in the fabric of her skirt unconsciously as she spoke, muscles remembering movements her mind no longer questioned. They began paying some of the utility bills with the money you sent. They said it was proof they were helping. I thanked them. I didn't know what I was thanking them for. My jaw tightened. After the 3rd year, Auntie moved in permanently, she said. She told me it was only temporary. That uncle needed to be closer to his work. Then uncle followed. Then their children. They took over rooms one by one. I was told to move into the smaller back room to make everyone comfortable. Her voice trembled for the first time. I thought it was still temporary. I closed my eyes slowly. When did they tell you the house was no longer yours? I asked carefully. She swallowed. After Auntie became sick, she said. They said your money was no longer enough to support everyone. They said you had signed the house over to them to compensate for my care. Every word scraped against my spine. They showed me documents, she added quickly. I didn't understand them. They said lawyers were involved. They said you trusted them. My blood ran cold. And when did the maid uniform begin? I asked quietly. She hesitated. After they said I needed to earn my keep, she whispered. They said shelter is not free in this world. They said I was grown now. They said a woman must be useful. Her shoulders shook slightly then, the controlled composure finally cracking. At first I only cleaned my own room. Then the house. Then their rooms. Then the guests. They removed my school funds 2 years later. They said education was a luxury we could no longer afford. My hands trembled in my lap as I listened. I saw each year unfold like a theft conducted with surgical patience. Did anyone ever hit you? I asked, forcing calm into my voice even as something dark churned beneath it. She shook her head slowly. Not with hands, she said. With words. With silence. With threat. With hunger. With humiliation. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she spoke, not violently, not dramatically, but with the exhaustion of someone who has been empty for too long. They told me every day that you were gone, that you abandoned me, that if you wanted me, you would have come. They told me no one would ever believe me if I spoke. They told me I should be grateful I wasn't thrown into the street. My vision blurred. Why didn't you call me? I whispered. She looked up at me, then with eyes so heavy they broke my heart. They controlled my phone, she said. They replaced it. They read my messages. They told me you never replied because you didn't care anymore. My hands clenched involuntarily. They said the money you sent was repayment for my foolish independence. They told me you were tired of me. They told me you had started a new life abroad. I felt something inside me fracture with a soundless violence. They convinced me you sold the house, she continued. They said the money was owed to them. They turned my home into their leverage. By the time I realized something was wrong, I had no proof, no power, and no place to go. She wiped her face hurriedly, as if embarrassed by her tears. I stayed because I was afraid, she admitted. And because I had nowhere else. Silence fell between us once more. The tree leaves rustled softly above us, mocking the cruelty of the truth with their peaceful indifference. For 10 years, I had believed distance measured in kilometers. I now understood it had been measured in manipulation. You are not a maid, I said firmly, turning her face gently toward mine. You never were, and you never will be again. That ends today. She searched my eyes hesitantly. They said you had no power over them anymore, she whispered. I felt the cold clarity of resolve settle into my bones. They are about to learn how wrong they were. I crowned her head with my palm gently then, not as a man reclaiming authority, but as a father reclaiming his child. As we stood to leave together, I looked back toward the house one last time. Inside those walls, 10 years of theft had been hidden behind legitimacy. Now, that legitimacy was about to collapse. I did not return to the police station that day. I did not storm into court with accusations blazing in my hands. I did not shout or announce what I had discovered. Instead, I did the opposite of what they expected a broken father to do. I went silent. I checked my daughter into a small rented apartment across town under my name, paid 6 months in advance, stocked the refrigerator, and left her with strict instructions not to answer unknown calls and not to return to the house under any circumstances. Only when I saw her sleep that night, truly sleep, not the shallow vigilance of someone trained for danger, did I allow my rage to become strategy instead of fire. The next morning, I contacted my lawyer abroad first, the one who had handled my property acquisitions while I worked overseas. His shock was immediate and unfiltered when I explained what had happened. Within hours, digital copies of every original document were sent to me. Purchase agreements, installment records, proof of international transfers, property tax payments, and the original clause designating my daughter as the intended occupant. The paper trail was flawless. What had been taken from me had been taken only through lies and intimidation, not through law. That discovery did not calm me. It empowered me. By the end of the week, I assembled a local legal team without notifying anyone inside that house. A property attorney, a criminal lawyer, a financial auditor. I told them everything, not as a grieving father, but as a man who understood that power returns only when evidence speaks louder than emotion. They listened without interrupting. When I finished, the room went still. The property attorney spoke first. "They are squatters," he said simply. "But what they've done to your daughter crosses into coercion and fraud." That word, fraud, felt like a hammer in my chest. The financial auditor requested access to my international transfer history. I gave it to him. Within days, a pattern began to emerge that made my stomach turn. The money I had been sending for maintenance, utilities, taxes, and my daughter's expenses had not always gone where it was supposed to go. Large withdrawals, redirections, accounts bearing names I recognized too well. They had not only stolen the house, they had been laundering my provision into their own financial expansion while convincing my child she was a burden. Every discovery sharpened the picture further. The business my brother-in-law now bragged about owning, seated with my money. The renovations inside the house, paid with my transfers. My daughter's unpaid labor, a condition they disguised as survival. My sister-in-law's illness that justified the permanent takeover, fabricated in documentation. What stunned me most was not the scale of the theft. It was the calm with which it had been executed. This had not been panic-driven survival. This had been a decade-long operation. When all the preliminary evidence was gathered, my attorneys advised caution. "Do not confront them yet," they said. "If they become aware of the investigation, they may destroy records, manipulate witnesses, or accelerate asset movement." I agreed immediately. I had already learned what happens when you move before you understand the full shape of your enemy. So I played the role they expected. I returned to the house alone 2 days later, unannounced, dressed simply, without documents in my hands or anger on my face. The gate opened cautiously. My sister-in-law stood there with a smile that shook slightly at its edges. "You didn't call," she said. "I came to talk," I replied calmly. Inside, everything looked the same. Expensive furniture resting on stolen ground, strangers wearing comfort they had not earned. My brother-in-law offered me a chair like a king, pretending generosity to a visitor in a home that did not belong to him. They spoke carefully now, too carefully. They offered tea, asked about my work abroad, avoided my daughter's name entirely. I watched them perform innocence. Then I gave them exactly what they wanted to hear. "I have no intention of disrupting her life here," I said quietly. "I only came to understand what happened while I was gone." Relief washed across their faces too quickly. That was their mistake. They spoke freely after that. About responsibility. About how hard it had been to manage things alone. About how my daughter had struggled to adapt to maturity. They never once used the word ownership. They spoke as if the house had simply absorbed into their identity through time, as if possession could be naturalized by comfort alone. I left without confrontation, and they believed they were safe. Over the next 3 weeks, the quiet setup tightened like a noose they could not see. The property attorney initiated a silent verification request through land registry channels. The auditor escalated the financial review through institutions obligated to respond. The criminal lawyer prepared affidavits documenting psychological coercion, unlawful confinement of property, and financial exploitation of a dependent adult. None of these moves touched the house directly yet. That was intentional. Meanwhile, I strengthened my daughter. We visited a doctor, a counselor, a legal advocate who specialized in coercive control. She spoke haltingly at first, then in floods, then in exhausted relief. Each truth she released reclaimed a piece of her from the decade that had swallowed her voice. The counselor diagnosed long-term psychological coercion and emotional captivity. The report did not describe her as weak. It described her as survived. Each day she stood a little straighter, spoke a little louder, began to remember who she had been before obedience was weaponized against her. On the 22nd day, the first letter arrived at the house. A verification notice from the land authority. Then another. Then a banking inquiry. Then a tax compliance alert. Then a summons. By the time my sister-in-law called me in a panic, 5 different institutions had opened parallel inquiries into assets and transactions they had long assumed were invisible. Her voice shook now the way my daughters once had. "Why is this happening?" she demanded. I answered calmly. "Because the silence you relied on expired." The house that had once felt untouchable began to feel very small to them. Investigators requested records they no longer had. Banks froze accounts they could not justify. Neighbors whispered. Relatives asked questions. Their business partner demanded proof of capital sources. My brother-in-law's confidence shrank with every day that passed. And still, I did not confront them. I waited. The final component of the setup came quietly, almost invisibly. My property attorney submitted the original ownership claim with a secondary petition designating my daughter as rightful occupant. My criminal attorney submitted the psychological coercion report. My auditor submitted a traced flow of misappropriated funds. All in one motion. All at once. The trap did not close with noise. It closed with paperwork. On the 41st day after my return, an official enforcement order was issued. They were to vacate, but they did not know that yet. Only I did. And that night, as I sat beside my daughter in her small but safe apartment, watching her eat without fear for the first time in years, I told her only one thing. "Tomorrow, you go back to your house." Her eyes widened cautiously. "As what?" she whispered. "As its owner," I replied. She covered her mouth with her hands and began to cry. Not the tears of terror I had first seen at the gate, but the sobbing of someone finally allowing hope to breathe after a decade of suffocation. And for the first time since I had landed in this country, I allowed myself to feel something other than controlled fury. Anticipation. The order was executed early in the morning, not with shouting or spectacle, but with the quiet authority of law that does not need to raise its voice to be obeyed. Uniformed officials arrived at the gate just after 8, accompanied by representatives from the land authority and 2 legal officers carrying folders thick with documentation. Neighbors gathered silently behind curtains and half-open doors, sensing that something important was unfolding inside the walls where confidence had once lived untouchably. My sister-in-law answered the gate in a robe she wore like armor, confusion etched across her face until the first document was presented and the color drained from her skin. The house that had sheltered her certainty for 10 years suddenly felt unfamiliar beneath her feet. My brother-in-law arrived moments later, his car skidding slightly at the curb as he rushed toward the gathering crowd. He tried to speak with the practiced authority of someone who believed his voice alone could bend situations back into place. That confidence evaporated as the enforcement officer calmly explained the ruling, the verified ownership, the fraudulent transfers, and the misappropriated funds traced through their accounts. Each sentence landed with the weight of inevitability. There were no arguments left to make now, no corridors left to hide inside. Every lie they had layered over the years was dismantled not by accusation, but by recorded fact. I arrived a few minutes later with my daughter standing beside me, her hand folded tightly into mine. She wore simple clothes that day, not a uniform, not borrowed dignity, just herself. The neighbors turned openly to watch as we stepped through the gate together. My sister-in-law stared at my daughter as if seeing her for the first time without control attached. For a brief second, I saw something flicker across her face that might have been regret. But it was too late for regret to matter anymore. The structure she had built on quiet cruelty had already begun collapsing beneath her. The legal officer read the enforcement order aloud in full view of everyone present. The house was to be vacated immediately. All personal property not belonging to the legal owner was to be removed under supervision. Any attempt to interfere would result in escalation to criminal charges. My brother-in-law demanded extensions, delays, negotiations. He spoke in the same commanding tone he had once used at the gate. This time, it carried no weight. Authority does not argue with trespassers. It only moves them. My daughter did not speak. She simply watched as years of imposed dominance were stripped away without noise. Her eyes moved slowly across the people who had once controlled her movements, her time, her voice. She did not look triumphant. She looked astonished at the simplicity of truth when the world finally decides to honor it. When the officials directed my sister-in-law to begin removing her belongings, the woman's composure broke at last. She cried loudly, angrily, as though grief itself were another tool she could weaponize. The crowd watched in silence. Inside the house, drawers were opened. Boxes were packed. Furniture was labeled. All the grand renovations funded by stolen money stood exposed as evidence rather than achievement. My auditor moved quietly from room to room with officials, verifying items whose purchase had been traced through illicit transfers. Every marked object felt like reclaiming oxygen from a suffocating room. My daughter followed behind them hesitantly at first, afraid even now that she might be reprimanded for standing where she stood. Each step she took deeper into the house, as its owner was a step back into herself. When we reached the back room, the room they had reduced her life to, she stopped. The walls were bare. The bed was narrow. The window was small. I felt the full weight of the decade she had disappeared into that space press against my ribs. She reached out and touched the wall gently, then turned to me with tears in her eyes. "This was my world," she whispered. I placed my hand over hers gently. "It isn't anymore," I said. The eviction unfolded not with drama, but with the slow humiliation of exposure. Neighbors who had once treated my relatives with reverence now watched quietly as their belongings were carried out in boxes. Whispers moved across the street. Phones were lifted discreetly. The hierarchy of that neighborhood shifted in real time, not because I spoke, but because reality finally did. There is no spectacle more disarming than quiet justice. When the last box was removed and the final signature recorded, the officials handed the keys to my daughter. She stared at them as if they might vanish. Then her fingers closed around the metal. For the first time in 10 years, control rested where it had always belonged. My sister-in-law attempted to speak as she was escorted out. Her words tangled between apology and accusation, never quite landing on either. I did not answer her. I did not need to. The house itself had already delivered the only response that mattered. My brother-in-law avoided my gaze entirely as he left, his shoulders bent under a future he had falsely believed was already secured. When the gate closed behind them, the world inside those walls changed in one quiet motion. My daughter stood in the courtyard, keys trembling in her palm. "I don't know what to do now," she whispered faintly. I smiled at her, not with pity, not with fury, but with calm assurance. "Now," I said, "you live." That afternoon, we walked through every room together. Each space felt larger than it had ever been because it no longer belonged to fear. We opened windows. We let light fall into corners that had been dim for years. We moved furniture. We removed what did not belong. For the first time since her childhood, she spoke freely inside her own walls without checking who might overhear. Laughter felt uncertain at first, like a language her mouth had forgotten how to shape. But it returned. Over the next months, restoration replaced survival. She returned to education through a program my attorneys helped arrange. Trauma counseling continued, not because she was broken, but because healing deserves witnesses. Slowly, her posture changed. Her voice strengthened. Her eyes stopped calculating threat before comfort. The house became what it had always been meant to be. Not a monument to theft, but a container for growth. My relative's world did not recover quietly. Accounts remained frozen in litigation. Business partners withdrew. Social standing fractured. The narrative they had carefully curated collapsed under the simple fact that truth does not disappear simply because it was inconvenient to acknowledge. They did not go to prison, but they did lose the only thing they valued more than money: control. In some ways, that was a harsher sentence than any court could have imposed. One evening, months later, as I sat on the veranda watching my daughter water the small garden we had planted together, she turned to me suddenly and asked, "Why didn't you come back sooner?" The question was not accusatory. It was curious, human, healed enough to ask without bitterness. "I believe distance was only measured in miles," I answered honestly. "I learned too late that it is also measured in silence." She nodded thoughtfully, accepting the truth of that without resentment. Then she smiled and returned to her plants. And in that moment, I understood that restoration is not the erasure of pain. It is the ability to live beside it without being governed by it. The house remembered its owner not because walls carry memory, but because truth always reclaims the ground it was built on. And my daughter, once reduced to a uniform in her own life, now moved freely through her future with her name restored to every room she entered. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you reflect on hidden family betrayal, please like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of stolen futures, quiet justice, and emotional restoration.